The Bible was a leather-bound King James version that Edna Briggs had never once seen her husband open. Walter kept it in the nightstand drawer beside their bed for 40 years. Not because he was a religious man. He was not. He went to church on Christmas and Easter because Edna went, and because a man in Russell County, Kansas, who did not show up for Christmas and Easter would have more explaining to do than it was worth. But the Bible had belonged to his mother, and Walter kept things that had belonged to people he loved. And so the Bible stayed in the nightstand drawer, and Edna never thought much about it beyond that. She opened it 3 days after they buried him. She had been putting things in order the way a woman puts things in order when the person she has spent 41 years beside is suddenly gone and the house is too quiet. And the only remedy for the quiet is to keep your hands moving. She was going to place the memorial card from the funeral inside the front cover, the way people do, the way her own mother had done with her father's Bible, and she opened the cover and a folded piece of paper fell out onto the kitchen table and landed face down on the oilcloth. She set the memorial card aside, she picked up the paper, she unfolded it. It was a map. She recognized the farm immediately. The property lines, the fence lines, the house and the barn and the well and the road and the small stream that ran through the southeast corner in wet years and went nearly dry in August. All of it drawn in pencil on a sheet of drafting paper, the kind you could get at the county courthouse. And in the corner of the paper, she could see the Russell County seal, faded now, but still legible. But the map was more than a map of boundaries and buildings. It was covered with writing, small, careful handwriting in Walter's hand, dozens of notes, crowded into every section of the farm, and she could see from the varying darkness of the pencil marks that these notes had not all been written at the same time. Some were dark and sharp. Some were faded nearly to nothing. They had been added over years, over decades, layer by layer, like the rings of a tree. She read some of the notes. Along the stream, spring meltwater reaches this point in March, pools here 3 to 4 days before flowing south. A date, 1931. In the middle of the southern section, topsoil, here is darker retains moisture for 2 weeks longer than the northern side after June rains. A date, 1938. Along the western fence line, limestone outcrop visible after heavy rain running northwest to southeast, approximately 200 feet, estimated depth 4 to 6 feet. A date, 1943. And in the northwest corner of the farm, the corner that always dried out last in spring, the corner where the wheat grew taller and greener than anywhere else on the property, there was a mark. A simple X drawn in pencil, circled twice, and next to it 3 words in Walter's handwriting. Dig here. Water. The date next to the X was 1967, 2 years before he died. Edna sat at the kitchen table for a long time looking at the map. Then she called her son. Colt Briggs was 32 years old and had been working this land since he was 14. He knew every acre of it the way a man knows something he has given his days and his body to, across 18 years of mornings. He knew the soil in each section, the drainage patterns, the yield differences between the north fields and the south fields, the way the land behaved in a wet spring versus a dry one. He knew where the equipment needed to go carefully and where it could move freely. He knew which fence lines had been repaired in the last 5 years and which ones needed attention. He had never seen this map. He drove over when Edna called and sat down at the kitchen table, and she placed the folded paper in front of him, and he opened it and did not say anything for a long time. He read every note. He traced the pencil lines with his eyes, moving across the farm the way you move across familiar ground, checking each annotation against what he knew, what he had seen, what his own experience of this land had taught him. Some of the notes confirmed things he knew: the drainage pattern in the southeast, the soil quality difference between the northern and southern sections, things he had learned himself over 18 years. But other notes described things he had never thought to look for: The temperature difference in the northwest corner after a cold rain, the way the grass root structure differed from one section to another, the limestone formation along the western fence. 40 years of observation written in a hand he had known his whole life, and he had never known any of it existed. He looked at the X in the northwest corner. He read the 3 words beside it. He looked at the date. 1967. His father had drawn that mark 2 years ago and had not said a word about it. Had not said there is something in the northwest corner. Had not said I think there is water under there. Had not said anything at all beyond the single remark he had made once, years ago, that Colt was only now beginning to understand the full weight of. The best soil on the farm is right there, Walter had said. He had been standing at the edge of the northwest field on a morning in late spring, looking at the wheat that always grew taller and greener in that corner than anywhere else, and Colt had been standing beside him and had nodded and moved on to the next task because there was always a next task. And because Walter never elaborated on his observations, and because Colt had not yet learned that the things his father said without elaboration were precisely the things worth stopping for. He wished now he had stopped. He wished he had asked. He wished he had said, "What do you mean, the best soil? Why is it the best? What do you see when you look at it that I am not seeing?" But he had not asked. And now Walter was in the ground on the west side of the Russell County Cemetery, and the only conversation left available was the one written in pencil on this piece of drafting paper. Colt looked at his mother. He asked if Walter had ever mentioned this to her. Any of it. The map, the observations, the X in the northwest corner, any of it. She said he had not. She said she had not known the map existed until she opened the Bible to place the memorial card inside. She said she had been opening that Bible for 41 years and had never seen it. Colt looked back at the map. He looked at the dates. 1931, 1938, 1943, 1951, 1967, 38 years of data points, 38 years of a man walking his land after every rain, after every thaw, after every drought, writing down what he saw in handwriting that grew more economical with each passing decade as he learned more precisely what mattered and what could be left out. He folded the map carefully and put it in the left breast pocket of his jacket. He kept it there for the rest of the winter. Now let me tell you about Walter Briggs, because you cannot understand what that map represented without understanding the man who made it. Walter was born in 1898 in a farmhouse 12 miles south of Russell that no longer exists. He was the third of 5 children, the son of a man who worked other people's land his whole life and died without ever owning any of it. Walter had understood from childhood that the land itself was the thing that mattered. Not the equipment, not the buildings, not the money in a savings account. The land was what lasted. Everything else was temporary. He bought the 320 acres in Russell County in 1929 from a widow named Clara Vesper, who had decided after her husband's death that she wanted nothing more to do with Kansas soil. The price was low because the timing was bad, and because Clara wanted to be finished with it quickly. Walter paid what he could afford, which was most of what he had, and he signed the papers and drove home to the property he now owned and stood in the northwest corner of the farm in the late afternoon light and looked at the wheat stubble and the pale Kansas sky and felt something settle into him that he recognized as rightness. He had found the place where he was supposed to be. He farmed it for 40 years. He was not a famous man. He was not a wealthy man. He was not the kind of man who spoke at meetings or wrote letters to the county paper or held opinions that anyone outside his immediate neighborhood cared about. He was a wheat farmer who went to bed early and rose before dawn and spent the hours in between doing the slow, patient work of learning what the land would and would not support. He had a particular habit that his neighbors found eccentric and his children found mysterious. After every significant rain, when other farmers were sitting on their porches waiting for the ground to dry enough to work, Walter would put on his boots and go out and walk the entire farm, not to check on the crop or the fence lines or the equipment, not to do anything productive in the conventional sense. He walked after the rain because the rain was when the land showed you things that kept hidden in dry weather. And Walter had understood very early in his farming life that the most important information was the information that the land did not offer freely. He walked every fence line. He walked every field edge. He walked the low spots and the high spots and the transitions between them. He was looking for one thing: where did the water go? Most farmers knew the obvious answer. Water flows downhill, collects in low spots, finds its way to the creek. Walter knew the obvious answer. He also knew that the obvious answer was only the beginning, and that the land had a second set of answers underneath the first set that required a different kind of attention to access. He had noticed in his first years on the farm that the northwest corner behaved differently from every other section. After a heavy rain, the water in the northwest corner lingered, not for hours, the way it lingered in the low spots of the south fields where the drainage was poor, for days, 2 days, 3 days, sometimes longer, and the water that lingered there was colder than it should have been, colder than the rainwater itself, colder than the surface temperature of the soil. He had thought about this for several seasons before he arrived at an explanation that satisfied him. Cold water coming up from below, groundwater seeping up into the surface, mixing with the rainwater, keeping the puddles cold and persistent long after the rain had stopped and the sun had come out. Not surface water sitting on the ground, water coming from underneath. He had made his first note about this in 1931, 2 years after buying the farm, after a particularly heavy March rain that left the northwest corner standing in water for 4 days, while the rest of the farm dried out in 2. He had written northwest corner holds water 3 to 4 days after rain. Water is cold. Source appears to be below surface. He had written it on a piece of drafting paper he had picked up at the county courthouse, and he had folded the paper and placed it inside his mother's Bible for safekeeping. And that night had been the beginning of 40 years of quiet, unannounced observation. He observed the snow. In winter, when snow covered the entire farm to a uniform depth, the northwest corner melted differently. Everywhere else on the farm, the snow melted from the top down, the way snow melts when the air above it warms. In the northwest corner, the snow melted from the bottom up. The ground beneath the snow was warmer there than anywhere else on the farm, and the warmth was coming from below, from water moving underground that retained heat in a way that still rock did not. He observed the grass. The wheat grew better in the northwest corner, not because the surface soil was dramatically different, though it was somewhat darker and richer, but because the grass root structure was different. He had pulled tufts of grass from the northwest corner and compared them to tufts from the south end of the farm, and the root mass in the northwest corner was twice as thick, reaching twice as deep, drawing nourishment from a source that the grass elsewhere could not access. Something down there was feeding it. He observed the limestone. Along the western fence line after a particularly heavy rain in 1943, he had seen the edge of a rock formation emerge from the soil at the base of the fence. Gray limestone worn smooth by centuries of water movement running at an angle that took it from the surface near the fence into the ground as it moved northeast toward the center of the property. He had followed it along the fence as far as it was visible, about 200 feet, and then it had gone below grade and disappeared. But the direction it was traveling told him something about the underground structure of his land. He added each observation to the map. Not immediately. Walter was not a man who rushed conclusions. He would observe something, then wait to see it again in different conditions, in a different season, in a different year. Only when he had seen something happen at least twice under different circumstances, in ways that could not be attributed to a single unusual event, would he write it down. The map was not a diary, it was a record of verified facts. Each mark represented an observation he had confirmed. And over 40 years, the marks accumulated and the picture they formed became increasingly clear. There was water under the northwest corner of the farm. Not deep water, not the kind you had to drill 200 feet to reach. Shallow water trapped between the clay layer near the surface and the limestone formation below, building pressure, the way water builds pressure when it has nowhere to go, waiting for a crack in the rock where it could find its way up. Walter had been looking for the crack for years. He found it in November of 1967. There had been an exceptional rain that month, the kind of rain that falls in November in Kansas, when a warm front collides with cold air over the plains and drops 3 inches in 2 days. The northwest corner of the farm turned into a temporary pond, 2 feet deep at the center, fed from below as much as from the rain itself. Walter put on his boots and waded in. The water was cold at the surface, but warmer near the bottom, warmer than it had any business being in November. He found a fence post he had pulled from storage and drove it into the mud at the center of the pond. The post sank easily, going down through soft mud and then through looser material, almost a meter of penetration before it hit something hard. He pulled it back out. The hole it left, filled with water rising from below, rising faster than the pond surface was draining, rising with a pressure behind it that told him the source was not above but beneath. He stood in the November pond for a long time. The water was cold against his boots, and the sky was gray, and the wind was coming out of the northwest the way it always came in November, but he stood there until he was satisfied with what he had found. Then he went home and hung his wet boots by the door and sat down at the kitchen table and unfolded the map. He drew the X in pencil. He circled it twice. He wrote 3 words: dig here, water. It was the last entry he would ever make. He was 69 years old. He would live 2 more years. He would never dig the well himself. Perhaps his knees would not allow it. Perhaps he was not entirely certain enough to commit to the labor. Perhaps he simply understood that the digging was not his to do. He folded the map, placed it back inside the Bible, and said nothing to anyone. 14 months after Walter's funeral, Rex Dunbar drove his John Deere truck up the gravel drive and knocked on the door of the Briggs farmhouse. Rex was 45 years old and had been selling farm equipment and brokering well drilling services in Russell County for 22 years. He was not a bad man. He was a practical man, which in his profession meant he had learned to identify opportunity and approach it before someone else did. Walter Briggs had represented an unclosed sale for a decade, a farmer sitting on 320 acres of dryland wheat, who could have been irrigating and increasing his yield significantly, but who had declined year after year to spend the money on a deep well. Rex had made his pitch to Walter at least 4 times since 1959. Walter had listened politely and said he would think about it, and then not done anything. Now Walter was gone, and the farm belonged to Colt, who was 32 and had 40 years of farming ahead of him, and had not yet developed his father's particular resistance to the mathematics of the situation. Rex sat at the kitchen table and laid out the proposition. A deep well drilled to 260 feet would reach the Dakota Aquifer, the sandstone layer beneath the high plains that provided reliable pressure-fed water regardless of surface conditions. The drilling would cost $5,000. The pump would cost $2,000. The electricity to run the pump during irrigation season would run approximately $100 a month. Total first-year cost $7,000. But in a dry year, that well would yield 15 additional bushels per acre. Across 320 acres, that was 4,800 additional bushels. At the current price of $1.50 per bushel, the well paid for itself in the first season. Rex had made this presentation with variations dozens of times. He was good at it. The numbers were real. The logic was sound. Most farmers, when they heard it, either signed or said they needed to talk to their wives, which usually meant they would sign within the week. Colt listened to the whole presentation without interrupting. Then he said that his father had left him a map. Rex's expression changed in a way that Colt would remember for the rest of his life. Not the change of a man who has heard something interesting, the change of a man who has heard something that does not fit into his prepared categories and is trying to find a drawer to put it in. A map, Rex said. Colt told him about the notebook. He said Walter had been recording observations about the farm for 40 years. He said the map had dates going back to 1931. He said the map showed where to dig. Rex looked at him for a moment. Then Rex said that he was offering a professionally drilled well reaching the Dakota aquifer at 260 feet, and that a map drawn in pencil by a farmer, however experienced, was not the same thing as a drilling survey conducted by people with professional equipment. He called it a treasure map. He did not mean it cruelly. He was being practical, which was how he approached everything. And from a practical standpoint, the situation was clear. On one side, a proven technology with quantifiable results. On the other side, a piece of paper with pencil marks on it. But the phrase landed badly in the county, the way certain phrases do when they capture something that people find funny and a little condescending at the same time. And within 2 days, everyone in the Russell County Farm Cooperative was using it. Colt Briggs is going to dig where his father's treasure map says to dig. The X marks the spot. Did his father leave him a map inside the Bible? What does he think he's going to find? Colt heard all of it. He went to the cooperative meetings and sat in the metal folding chairs and listened to men he had known his whole life repeat the phrase to each other and laugh at the punchline. And he did not defend himself because he had not yet dug the hole and could not yet point to anything except a piece of paper and his own belief that his father had not been a foolish man. Earl Stovall came to him directly, the way Earl did things straight across a fence line, with no particular warmth but no particular malice either. Earl farmed a half section to the south and had been drilling deep wells since 1965 and had no patience for what he called the sentimental approach to farming. He said Colt had $11,000 in savings. He said Rex could have a crew on site within 2 weeks. He said the math was not complicated and the result was not uncertain, and Colt could spend the next growing season irrigating from a reliable source instead of gambling on a pencil mark in a dead man's Bible. Colt said he was going to dig first. Earl looked at him the way a man looks at someone he has given practical advice to and who has declined to take it. Then he went back across the fence line, and Colt went back to the kitchen table where the map was unfolded under the lamp. He spent a long evening with it. He had been studying it for weeks by then, carrying it in his jacket pocket during the day, and spreading it on the table in the evenings, cross-referencing the notes against his own knowledge of the property, trying to read the farm the way his father had read it. He was beginning to see things he had not seen before. The drainage pattern that Walter had noted in the southeast in 1938 was something Colt had observed himself but had never thought to write down. The soil difference between the north and south sections was something he had known experientially for years without ever articulating it. But the northwest corner was different. The notes about the northwest corner were denser than anywhere else on the map. More observations, more dates, more layers of pencil writing that told the story of a man returning to the same place across 40 years, looking at the same ground in different seasons and different conditions, watching something that most people would not have thought to watch. Cold water pools after rain, persistent moisture 3 days when surrounding areas dry in 1, frost melts upward from ground level, grass root mass significantly greater than Southfield's, limestone formation extending northeast from western fence, all of it pointing toward the same spot, all of it converging on the X. Walter had been looking at this corner of his farm since 1931. He had been building toward that X for 36 years before he drew it. He had walked through November pond water in his boots to confirm the pressure differential that told him something was coming up from below. He had driven a fence post into the mud to feel for the rock beneath the soft material. He had stood in cold water and felt with his feet what no instrument he owned could measure. And then he had come home and drawn the X and put the map back in the Bible and told no one. Colt thought about that for a long time. He thought about why a man would do that, why a man would spend 40 years gathering this information and then leave it folded in a Bible without a word to the person who would need it. It was not, he was increasingly sure, because Walter had been uncertain. A man who spends 40 years on a question and then draws an X with a circle around it is not uncertain. He has arrived somewhere. He has concluded something. It was something else. Something about the way Walter thought about knowledge and how it was properly passed from one generation to another. Walter had never been a man who explained himself. He communicated through action, through example, through the slow accumulation of demonstrated competence over time. He had never sat Colt down and taught him anything in the formal sense. What Colt knew about farming, he had learned by working alongside his father and watching and paying attention to what Walter paid attention to. Perhaps the map was the same thing, not an instruction, not a directive, a demonstration. Here is how you look at a piece of land. Here is what 40 years of paying attention to the same place looks like. Here is what you can find if you are willing to stay with something long enough to see it fully. The digging was the last lesson. Colt went to the hardware store in Russell the following week and bought a new shovel and a pickaxe and a stake driving rod. He put them in the back of the truck. He drove home. He ate dinner with his mother in the quiet house that still felt wrong without Walter's boots by the door, and afterward he sat on the porch in the March cold and looked northwest across the fields to the corner of the farm where his father had stood in November pond water and felt the answer with his feet. He did not start that evening. The ground was still too cold from the winter, and the frost had not fully left the top 2 feet of soil. He had learned from his father that you did not rush a piece of ground. You waited until it was ready to show you what it had. He waited through the rest of March and into April, watching the northwest corner the way his father had watched it going out after the spring rains, to stand at the edge of the field and observe what the water did. He saw it for the first time with full attention rather than passing notice. The water in the northwest corner lingered. 2 days, 3 days. The rest of the farm dried out, and the northwest corner was still damp, still showing standing water in the low areas, still cold when he pressed his hand against the soil. His father had been watching this for 38 years. The county was still laughing. Rex Dunbar had let it be known at the co-op meeting in March that Colt Briggs was going to dig a well by hand based on a treasure map, and the laughter had the particular quality of laughter at something that seems both harmless and absurd. Nobody was angry about it. Nobody felt threatened by it. It was just a young man doing an unusual thing because his father had left him an unusual piece of paper, and if that was how Colt Briggs wanted to spend his spring, well, that was his business. Earl Stovall had made his position clear and was not going to repeat himself. He had said his piece, and Colt had made his choice, and Earl was a man who accepted other people's choices once they had been made, even when he thought the choices were wrong. He had his own crops to think about and his pump to maintain, and he did not have time to stand at a fence line watching a grown man dig a hole in a field. Rex had moved on to other clients. There were 3 other farms in the county where the operators were ready to sign, and Rex was a man who did not spend time on lost causes. Colt went to bed early and rose before dawn the way his father had done, the way he had done since he was 14 years old, and on a morning in late April, when the frost was fully out of the ground and the soil in the northwest corner had the temperature and texture he had been waiting for. He loaded the shovel and the pickaxe and the stake rod into the wheelbarrow and pushed it across the field to the spot marked on the map. He stood there for a moment before he began. The northwest corner, the best soil on the farm, his father had said once, and never explained why and never needed to, because the explanation was folded in a Bible in the nightstand drawer and was now folded in Colt's jacket pocket, and had been waiting for this moment for 2 years. He looked at the wheat growing around him, taller and greener here than in any other part of the farm, drawing from something the rest of the field could not reach. He drove the shovel into the ground and began. The first 2 feet came out easily. Colt had expected that. The topsoil in the northwest corner was darker than anywhere else on the farm, almost black in the morning light, rich with organic matter that had been accumulating here since before Walter bought the land. It came out in clean, heavy scoops, the kind of soil that crumbles just right off the blade, not too wet and not too dry, the kind that a farmer recognizes immediately as something worth having. Each shovelful smelled of decades of wet seasons and dry ones of root systems going back through generations of prairie grass that had lived and died and decomposed in this corner of Russell County long before any Briggs had set foot on it. He worked steadily, not fast. There was no reason to hurry and several reasons to go carefully, and Colt had inherited enough of his father's temperament to understand that this was not a job where speed was a virtue. He dug and he lifted and he turned and he set the soil aside in an even pile to the east of the hole, building the pile methodically, not throwing the dirt carelessly, but placing it with the same attention he gave to everything on this farm. The morning was cool and overcast, the Kansas sky the particular flat gray of late April, and there was no wind yet, which was unusual for this time of year, and which Colt took as a kind of permission to concentrate. At 2 feet, the soil changed. Not dramatically, not in a way that would have told anyone anything who was not paying close attention. But Colt had spent 18 years learning this land through his hands and his feet, and the feedback that came up through the handles of tools, and he felt the change before he fully saw it. The shovel met slightly more resistance. The color shifted lighter, now more yellowish brown than black. The organic richness of the topsoil giving way to subsoil that had less history in it, material that had spent its existence below the reach of roots and weather. Still workable, still coming out in reasonable scoops, but different. He noted it. He did not write anything down. He did not need to. He was building a physical memory of this whole layer by layer, the same way his father had built a mental record of this corner of the farm observation, by observation year by year. He worked through the subsoil for another 1.5 feet. The pile beside the hole grew. The hole itself took on the particular quality of depth that changes your relationship to the ground when you are standing below the surface level, and the walls of earth are on either side of you, and the sky above seems slightly more distant than it did from above. Colt was not a man who minded enclosed spaces. He had worked in grain bins and crawl spaces and the confined quarters that farm life occasionally required, and he moved in the hole with the ease of a man accustomed to working in the places that most people would find uncomfortable. At 3.5 feet, he hit the clay. He knew it was coming. His father had written about it on the map, not in a note specifically about this location, but in a general observation about the subsurface structure of the northwest quadrant, made in 1951 and confirmed in 1958, clay layer present at 3 to 4 feet depth, dense gray-blue, approximately 8 inches thick. He had read that note 100 times in the preceding weeks and had pictured the layer in his mind without being able to fully anticipate what it would feel like when the shovel hit it. It felt like hitting the bottom of a river. The blade went in and stopped, not the gradual resistance of denser soil, but an actual arrest, the handle transmitting a shock up through his palms that told him clearly different material. He worked the blade free and looked at what it had pulled up. Gray-blue clay, dense and slick, the kind of material that forms when fine particles settle in still water over long periods of time. A geologist would have called it lacustrine clay deposited in an ancient lake bed that had dried up millions of years before the first humans set foot in Kansas. Colt called it exactly what the shovel was telling him: it was impermeable. He switched to the pickaxe. The pickaxe made better progress. Not fast progress, but real progress, breaking the clay into chunks that he could then lever out with the shovel blade and add to the pile. The clay came out in irregular pieces, dense and cold to the touch, each piece leaving a clean face behind it that showed the gray-blue color clearly. He worked through it for about 40 minutes, which was longer than the other layers had taken, despite the clay being only 8 inches thick. It was the hardest material he had encountered so far, and required a different quality of attention, more deliberate, more focused on the angle and force of each strike. When he broke through the bottom of the clay layer, the material beneath it was immediately different, lighter, looser, a mix of sand and fine gravel and small fragments of limestone material that moved almost freely around the pickaxe head material that had none of the structural resistance of the clay above it. He crouched at the bottom of the hole and reached down and ran his fingers through it. Granular, gritty, the kind of material that water moves through easily. He was at 4 feet. He went back to the shovel. The sand and gravel layer was easy to excavate, but more easily disturbed than the layers above it. The walls of the hole needed attention here. He worked more carefully, making sure he was removing material from the center of the hole rather than undercutting the walls, keeping the hole stable as it went deeper. The material came out cleanly. The hole deepened. At 5 feet, the gravel particles became larger. Pieces of limestone, some of them the size of his fist, mixed into the sandy material. He began striking them with the shovel blade and could feel the difference between hitting a loose stone and hitting the continuous bedrock below. The loose stones moved when he hit them. What was below them did not move at all. He cleared the bottom of the hole. The surface that emerged was flat and gray and absolutely continuous. It ran from one side of the hole to the other without interruption, without variation, without the irregularity that characterized every other material he had passed through. It was smooth in the way that only very old rock is smooth worn by water and time into a surface as consistent as poured concrete. Colt knelt at the bottom of the 5-foot hole and pressed his palm against it and felt the cold come up through his skin. Limestone, continuous limestone bedrock, exactly as his father had recorded in the note from 1943, lying precisely where the map said it would lie at the depth the map suggested extending in the direction the map predicted. Walter had found the edge of this formation along the western fence line and had traced its path underground for 24 years, until he was certain where it ran beneath the northwest corner of the farm. Colt took a breath. He was at 5 feet. The bedrock was here. The bedrock his father had spent decades accounting for in his observations was right here under his hands. He picked up the shovel and began cleaning the surface more thoroughly, pushing the last of the gravel and sand away from the limestone to get a clear view of what he was working with. He swept from east to west, then north to south, clearing a rectangle about 4 feet by 3 feet, and then he saw it. It was not dramatic. It was not a crack you could see from a distance or a feature that would have caught the eye of anyone not specifically looking for it. It was a fracture in the limestone surface, a dark line running across the cleaned rock, approximately 2 inches wide at its widest point, narrowing as it went, running from the northwest corner of the cleared area toward the southeast in a direction that Colt had to think about for a moment before he placed it, northwest to southeast. The same direction his father had noted for the limestone outcrop along the western fence line in 1943. The same formation, the surface expression of it along the fence line, the buried continuation of it here beneath 5 feet of soil and clay and gravel, the fracture zone where the rock had cracked under the pressure of whatever geologic forces had shaped this landscape millions of years before any human thought to walk across it. Colt looked at the crack for a long time. He was kneeling in a 5-foot hole in the northwest corner of his father's farm, looking at a feature in a limestone formation that his father had identified indirectly from the surface, from observations of water behavior and grassroot structure and the way snow melted in November without ever digging this hole or seeing this crack directly. He reached for the shovel and lowered the blade into the crack at its widest point. The blade went in easily, more easily than any material he had encountered since the topsoil. The metal slid in without resistance, as if the crack were full of nothing at all, and he pushed it deeper, angling the handle to let gravity carry the blade further in. And he felt the blade pass through loose gravel, and then through sand, and then through what felt like open space, a void below the rock surface. and then he stopped pushing and waited. Water moved up the blade. Not a rush, not a surge, a slow, deliberate rising the way water rises in a well when the pressure behind it is steady and patient and has been building for years. It came up the metal surface of the shovel blade and reached the lip of the crack and spilled over onto the cleaned limestone surface and began pooling at the bottom of the hole. It was clear, absolutely clear, the way water is clear when it has been filtered through 100 feet of limestone and sand and gravel for years before it reaches the surface. No sediment, no color, no cloudiness. It pooled in the lowest point of the hole bottom, and Colt watched it rise inch by inch, a quarter inch every few minutes, steady and unhurried, fed from below by something that had no intention of stopping. He pulled the shovel out. The water kept coming. He knelt at the edge of the pool. He reached down and dipped his hand in and felt the cold move up through his fingers and into his palm. 10 degrees, maybe 11. The kind of cold that water acquires when it has traveled a long distance underground, when it has been insulated from surface temperature by depth and rock and time, when it has been moving slowly through the dark for longer than any living thing can easily imagine. He cupped his hand and brought the water to his mouth. It was clean, it was sweet, it had a faint mineral taste, calcium from the limestone it had traveled through, the taste of the bedrock itself dissolved into the water over the years of its underground journey. It tasted like the farm. It tasted like the thing underneath the farm, the deep permanent thing that the soil and the weather and the seasons sat on top of, the thing that had been there before Walter bought the land and would be there long after the last Briggs farmed it. Colt sat back on his heels and looked at the water rising in the bottom of the hole. He did not shout. He did not stand up and look around for someone to tell. There was no one in the field with him. He had been alone since he pushed the wheelbarrow out from the barn that morning, and he had not told anyone when he was coming out here or what he expected to find, because there had been nothing to tell that he had not already told and that people had not already decided was unlikely. He sat alone in the hole his father had pointed him toward, watching the water his father had found with his feet and his eyes, and 40 years of patient attention, and he did not move for a long time. He reached into the inside pocket of his jacket and pulled out the folded map. He unfolded it carefully, holding it away from the wet walls of the hole, and opened it to the northwest corner. The X, the circle around it drawn twice, the 3 words in his father's handwriting, dig here, water. He looked at the date. 1967, 2 years before Walter died. Walter had stood somewhere near this spot, or perhaps in the November pond that had covered this spot, and had felt with a fence post and with his own feet what Colt was now seeing with his eyes. Walter had known. He had been certain enough to draw the circle twice, and then he had folded the map and put it in the Bible and never said a word. Colt sat in the hole with the water rising around his boots for a long time. He was thinking about his father, not about the water or the farm or the economics of irrigation or what Rex Dunbar would say when he found out. He was thinking about a man who had walked this corner of a Kansas farm for 40 years in every season, in rain and drought and cold and heat, paying attention to things that most people would not have thought worth paying attention to. Writing down what he saw in a private record that he never showed to anyone building, toward a conclusion that he trusted enough to mark with a pencil circle, but not compelled enough, or perhaps not positioned enough to act on himself. What had Walter been waiting for? The answer, sitting in the hole with the cold water rising, was not difficult to find. Walter had not been waiting for certainty. He had been certain since at least 1967, perhaps earlier. He had been waiting for Colt to be ready to receive it, not to be told, to find. There was something Walter understood about knowledge and how it was properly passed from one generation to another. You can tell a man where the water is, and he will file it away as information, as a fact to be acted on or ignored. You can make a man dig 6 feet down through topsoil and subsoil and gray-blue clay and limestone bedrock until the water rises around his boots, and he will understand it the way he understands the land itself, through his hands, through the resistance in the soil, through the shock that travels up a pickaxe handle when it hits something that will not move through the cold, that comes up through fingers pressed against rock that has been there since before any human walked across it. The digging was the lesson. The water was the proof. He folded the map and put it back in his pocket. He stood up. He looked at the water level, which had risen about 3 inches since he pulled the shovel out. Approximately 2 gallons a minute, he estimated. Steady, consistent, showing no sign of slowing. Then he climbed out of the hole and went to get his pipe. He spent the next several weeks developing what he would come to think of as the simplest water system on any farm in Russell County. He widened the excavation to give himself room to work, going about 6 feet across and 8 feet long, keeping the bottom clean and the walls stable. He lined the sides of the excavation with limestone rocks he pulled from the western fence line, where the outcrop had been visible since 1943, stacking them dry without mortar, the way rural Kansans had been building things since the first settlers arrived. The rocks held the walls stable and gave the water a clean surface to flow against. He set a screen over the fracture to keep debris from working its way into the flow. He cut a length of PVC pipe and fitted it at the lowest point of the collection area, angled to follow the natural grade of the land as it ran southeast toward the old stream bed. The pipe ran approximately 340 feet from the spring to a concrete cistern he poured near the barn, 6 feet across and 4 feet deep, sealed at the bottom, open at the top with a screen lid to keep the water clean. From the cistern, a secondary line ran to the kitchen garden. A third line ran to the animal troughs. A fourth ran up into the house. Total materials cost $340. Not a misprint. $340, including the pipe, the fittings, the screen, the concrete for the cistern, and the hardware for the connections. No drilling crew, no pump motor, no electrical connection, no monthly utility bill. No maintenance beyond clearing the intake screen once a month with a brush he could reach without bending down. The flow rate was approximately 3 gallons per minute. That was 180 gallons per hour. In a 24-hour day, with the spring flowing continuously, the way it had been flowing since he opened the crack, that was 4,320 gallons of water every single day, delivered by gravity alone from a source that his father had located with a pencil and a pair of boots. His neighbors were paying between $800 and $1,200 a year to run the electric pumps that brought water up from the Dakota Aquifer 260 feet below their farms. Rex Dunbar's clients had paid $7,000 in the first year for the privilege of accessing that deep water. Colt's total investment, including the pipe and the stones and the concrete cistern, was $340. The water kept flowing. He built the vegetable garden that summer. He had always kept a small kitchen garden beside the house the way most farm families did. But now, with reliable water available at no cost, the question of scale changed entirely. He laid out a 10-acre plot on the south side of the barn, using the grade of the land to run irrigation lines from the cistern by gravity, no pump required. He planted sweet corn and tomatoes and peppers and melons and green beans in quantities that were well beyond household use. Quantities that reflected a man who had worked out the economics of the situation and understood that free water transformed the calculation of what a 10-acre plot could produce. The garden came in that first summer, and Colt drove to the Saturday market in Russell with produce that was noticeably better than what most of the other vendors were bringing, because it had been watered consistently through the dry stretch in July, when most gardens in the county were struggling. He sold out before noon. He drove home with money in his pocket from a 10-acre plot that had cost him nothing to irrigate. The county noticed. Of course it noticed. A lush green garden surrounded by dryland wheat fields stood out the way anything out of place stands out in a landscape that is otherwise uniform. And farmers who drove the county roads on their way to their own fields could not help but see it and compare it to what they knew about the summer's rainfall, which had been below average, and wonder. By mid-July, Earl Stovall had driven over. Earl stood at the fence line of the vegetable garden and looked at the rows of corn and the tomato plants heavy with fruit and the melon vines spreading across the ground in the particular vigorous way that happens when a plant has access to more water than it strictly needs. He looked at the irrigation lines running between the rows. He looked at the direction those lines ran back toward the barn and the cistern. He asked Colt where the water was coming from. Colt told him about the spring, about the hole, about the limestone fracture at 5 feet and the water that had been rising at 2 gallons a minute since April. He told it plainly, the way he told most things, without drama and without any particular emphasis on the fact that he had done exactly what he said he was going to do, and what Earl had told him was a waste of time. Earl listened without interrupting, which was unusual for Earl, who generally had something to say while other people were still saying something. He was quiet for a moment after Colt finished. Then he asked how deep the hole was. Colt said 6 feet. Earl thought about that. 6 feet. The Dakota aquifer was at 260 feet. Rex Dunbar's drilling crew had gone through 254 additional feet of rock to reach the same resource that Walter Briggs had located with 40 years of looking at puddles. Earl went home and did not say anything about the treasure map for the rest of that summer. In August, Rex Dunbar drove up the gravel road and knocked on the door. Colt walked him out to the spring. Rex stood at the edge of the lined excavation and looked at the water flowing steadily from the limestone fracture, clear and cold in the August heat, filling the collection basin at a rate that had not varied meaningfully since April. He looked at the PVC pipe carrying the water to the cistern. He looked at the cistern itself. He looked at the garden on the south side of the barn, green and heavy with late summer produce in a county that had received below average rainfall since June. Rex was not a man given to extended silences. He talked for a living. He had built his business on the ability to fill a room with words that moved people toward a decision, and silence was not part of his professional toolkit. But he stood at the edge of Walter Briggs's spring and was quiet for a long time. He asked how much water it produced. Colt told him 3 gallons a minute. He asked if the flow had dropped during the dry summer. Colt told him it had not varied by more than a fraction since the day he opened the crack. He asked if Colt thought it would flow through the winter. Colt said the limestone was still wet to the touch, even in August, which suggested the source was deep enough to flow year-round. Rex looked at the system again. The spring, the pipe, the cistern. The whole thing laid out in the economics of a balance sheet that required very little imagination to read. He had sold 23 deep wells in Russell County since 1959. 23 farms had paid his drilling fees and bought his pumps and connected to his electrical service contracts and sent him business every year when the pumps needed maintenance. None of them had found their water with a pencil mark on a piece of drafting paper. He had called it a treasure map. He had said it in a context that made it clear he found the concept mildly ridiculous, and the county had picked up the phrase and run with it, and Colt had heard it for months from every direction. Rex had meant it as a practical observation. A map drawn by a farmer was not a geological survey. That was still true. Walter Briggs had not been a geologist. He had not conducted a formal survey. He had not used any instrument more sophisticated than a fence post and a pair of boots. And he had found water at 6 feet that was clean and cold and flowing in August, when the county had received 60% of its normal summer rainfall. Rex said he had been selling drilling rigs and brokering well services for 22 years, and that not one of his customers had ever found water with a pencil and a piece of paper. Colt said that Rex had never had a customer who had spent 40 years watching where the water went. Rex thought about that. He looked at the spring one more time. Then he got in his truck and drove back to town. He lost 3 clients in the following months, farmers who had been close to signing well drilling contracts and who, after hearing what had happened on the Briggs place, decided to spend a season walking their own land first. Most of them found nothing. The geological conditions that had produced the spring on Walter's farm, the specific combination of clay layer and limestone fracture and elevated aquifer, were particular to that area of Russell County and did not exist in the same form everywhere. Most farms did not have a 6-foot spring waiting to be found. But 3 farmers found something. Earl Stovall found a seepage point in the southeast corner of his property where groundwater seeped through a clay band at about 8 feet down, not enough for large-scale irrigation, but enough to fill a garden cistern without electricity. 2 other operators found similar small seepage zones they had walked past for years without noticing. The flow rates were modest, the applications were limited. But the principle had been demonstrated in terms that farmers could understand if you pay enough attention to enough ground. For long enough, the ground will tell you things that no drilling rig can reveal because the drilling rig only goes straight down, and groundwater moves in ways that have nothing to do with straight down. The summer passed, the garden produced, the spring flowed. Colt drove to the Russell market every Saturday through June and July and August and into September, and he sold sweet corn and tomatoes and peppers and melons that his neighbors could not match for quality or consistency in a dry year because his plants had never been stressed for water from the moment he put them in the ground. He came home from the last market day of the season with just under $4,000, which was more than he had made from 10 acres of wheat in any of the last 3 years. He sat at the kitchen table that evening and looked at the numbers on a piece of paper. The vegetable garden, 10 acres, had generated $4,000. The wheat fields, 310 acres, had generated approximately $6,000 at a net after expenses. The garden was 3% of his total land area and was generating 65% of what his wheat income generated because water was free. His father had found the water. His father had known it was there. His father had drawn the map and placed it in the Bible and waited for Colt to find it and do the arithmetic himself. Colt folded the paper and set it on top of the map, which was still spread on the kitchen table the way it had been spread most evenings since January. He looked at the X in the northwest corner. He looked at the 3 words, dig here, water. He thought about Walter standing in November mud in 1967, 69 years old, driving a fence post into the ground and feeling the rock below it and feeling the water pressure beneath the rock. Standing in the cold and the wind and knowing with his feet what the ground was holding. 2 years before he died, he had found it 2 years before he died and had marked it and said nothing to anyone and trusted that the map would find its way to the right hands at the right time. He got up from the table and washed his dish and turned off the lamp in the kitchen and went to bed, and the spring in the northwest corner flowed on through the night at 3 gallons a minute, the same as it had flowed since April, the same as it would flow tomorrow, patient and cold and clear. The spring flowed through its first winter without interruption. Colt had not been entirely certain it would. The logic of the elevated aquifer suggested that the water source was insulated from surface conditions, that the clay layer above it and the limestone below it created a system that recharged slowly from below rather than responding to what happened at the surface in any given season. But logic and certainty are different things, and through the first November and December, after he opened the crack, he walked out to the northwest corner more often than was strictly necessary, and crouched at the edge of the collection basin and put his hand in the water and confirmed what he needed to confirm. It was still cold. It was still flowing. The rate had not dropped measurably from what it had been in April when he first opened the fracture. January came in hard the way Kansas Januaries did, with temperatures that dropped below 0 for 2 weeks straight and ground frost that went down 18 inches and ice that formed on every surface water source in the county. The stock ponds froze solid. The creek in the southeast corner of the farm went under ice. The cistern near the barn developed a thin skim of ice on the surface each morning that Colt broke with a stick before filling the animal troughs. The spring did not freeze. The water coming out of the limestone fracture was too cold to freeze in the usual sense, but what Colt meant when he thought about the spring not freezing was something more fundamental. The flow did not stop. The source did not fail. The collection basin stayed liquid under the lid he had built for it, the water arriving at a consistent temperature and a consistent rate through the coldest stretch of weather Russell County had seen in a decade. He stood at the spring one morning in the second week of January when the temperature was 12 degrees and the sky was the white. That means more cold is coming. And he thought about his father standing in the November pond in 1967. Walter had been 69 years old, which was 3 years older than Colt was now. And he had waded into 2 feet of cold water and driven a fence post into the mud to feel what was underneath. He had done it because the information he needed could not be obtained from the bank of the pond. You had to go into the thing you were trying to understand. You had to put yourself in contact with it. Colt had been learning that lesson for 3 years now, not as an abstract principle, but as a practice, a way of moving through the farm that was different from how he had moved through it before he found the map. He paid attention differently. He went out after the rains. He walked the fence lines. He noticed things he had been walking past for 18 years without seeing because he had never been taught to look for them. Walter had taught him finally from inside a Bible. The years settled into a rhythm. The spring produced its water every day, every season, without fail. The vegetable garden expanded slightly in the second year when Colt added a second cistern to increase his storage capacity and extend the irrigation season at both ends. He planted earlier in spring because he could water from the moment the ground was workable without depending on rainfall, and he kept the garden producing into October when his neighbors with similar plots were watching their last tomatoes split for lack of water. The market in Russell was where most of the produce went Saturday mornings from June through September, and Colt became a familiar presence there in the particular way that a vendor becomes familiar when his produce is reliably better than the competition in dry years, which in central Kansas meant most years. People asked him how he kept the garden so consistent in the dry months. He told them about the spring. The story of the spring was well known in Russell County by the mid-1970s and had lost most of its novelty by then, but people still liked to hear the details. And Colt told them without embellishment the same way every time because the story did not require embellishment. The economics of the situation were not complicated, but they were significant. The vegetable garden, irrigated at zero cost, generated approximately $4,000 per season in the early years and grew as Colt refined what he planted and how he sold it. The wheat fields generated their income, which varied with the weather and the price, as wheat income always did. The spring did not make Colt wealthy, but it gave him a margin that most dryland farmers in the county did not have, a cushion against the dry years, a source of income that did not depend on the rainfall reports. Then 1976 arrived. The drought that year was not the worst in Kansas history. The Dust Bowl years of the 1930s remained the benchmark against which central Kansas measured its suffering, and 1976 did not approach that. But it was severe and sustained in a way that put real pressure on farms that depended on irrigation because the irrigation demands were higher than normal, while the conditions for meeting those demands were deteriorating. The Dakota Aquifer was a large and in some ways reliable resource, but it was not infinite, and it did not recharge quickly. Each gallon pumped from it came from a reserve that had accumulated over centuries of slow percolation through the overlying rock. And in dry years, when surface recharge was reduced while pumping demand increased, the water table dropped. Not catastrophically, not enough to dry the wells, but enough to make the pumps work harder to draw from deeper to consume more electricity per gallon delivered than they had the year before. The electricity bills for the irrigating farms in Russell County roughly doubled in the summer of 1976 compared to a normal summer. Farms that had been paying $100 a month to run their pumps were paying $200. Farms with larger acreage under irrigation were paying more. The additional cost ran to several $1,000s for the season on a full operation, which was not catastrophic on a good wheat year, but which, combined with the reduced yields that came with the drought, conditions for dryland acreage, made 1976 a year that some farmers in the county would remember, with the particular sharpness that financial stress leaves behind. Colt's water bill for 1976 was zero. The spring in the northwest corner had nothing to do with the Dakota aquifer or the surface conditions that were stressing it. The elevated aquifer that Walter had identified, trapped between the clay layer and the limestone formation, recharged through a different mechanism and at a different time scale than the deep aquifer below. It was not directly dependent on annual rainfall. It was a slower, deeper system, and a single dry summer, even a severe one, did not register in its output. The spring flowed at 3 gallons per minute in June of 1976. It flowed at 3 gallons per minute in July. In August, when his neighbors were watching their pump electricity bills and doing mental arithmetic about what the harvest needed to look like to come out ahead, it flowed at 3 gallons per minute. The rate had not varied meaningfully in 6 years. The vegetable garden in 1976 was the best Colt had produced. The consistent irrigation through a summer when most gardens in the county were stressed produced a quality of produce that stood out at the market even more than usual, and the prices he got reflected that, because when supply drops, quality commands a premium, and his supply had not dropped. He drove home from the last Saturday market in September of 1976 with over $4,000 from the 10-acre plot and a sense of what his father had left him that went beyond the map and the X and the 3 words. Walter had left him stability, not the static kind of stability that comes from avoiding risk, but the rooted kind that comes from understanding your land well enough to identify what it offers that is genuinely reliable. The wheat was subject to weather and market and all the variables that made dryland farming in central Kansas a perpetual negotiation with forces you could not control. The spring was not subject to those variables in the same way. It was subject to the deep geology of the place, which changed on timescales that made human planning horizons irrelevant. As long as the formation held, the water flowed. And the formation was limestone that had been in place since Kansas was the floor of an inland sea. Earl Stovall came over that fall. He came with less certainty than usual, which for Earl represented a significant departure from his normal operating mode. He stood in Colt's kitchen and drank coffee and talked about the year in a way that acknowledged what he had been unwilling to acknowledge 6 years earlier, which was that the math had come out differently than he had expected. He talked about the electricity bills. He talked about 2 other farmers in the county who were looking at borrowing against next year's crop to cover the irrigation costs from this one. He talked about what it would mean to have a water source that did not connect to the electric meter. Then he said he had been walking his land after the rains. Since the summer after Colt found the spring, he had been going out after significant rains and looking at where the water went and how long it stayed. He had not found anything like what Walter had found. His land had different underlying geology, and the elevated aquifer conditions that had produced the Briggs Spring did not appear to be present on his property. But he had found something, a seepage point in the southeast corner of his half section where water moved through a clay band at about 8 feet and collected in a small natural depression before draining away. The flow was modest, half a gallon per minute at best, and only in wet months. Not enough to irrigate anything significant, but enough to fill an animal cistern without connecting to the electric pump, enough to water a kitchen garden, enough to matter on the margins of a dry year. He had walked past that corner of his farm for 20 years without seeing it. He had walked past it because he had never been looking for it. Walter Briggs had never told Earl Stovall anything about groundwater observation, but the story of Walter's map had told it, and 6 years of watching Colt's garden through the dry summers had told it more emphatically, and now Earl had a small seepage point in his southeast corner that was saving him money he could not currently afford to spend. 2 other farmers in the county had found similar small features, not springs, not the kind of reliable flow that Walter had located, but groundwater expressions that had been present all along, patient and unnoticed, waiting for someone to be looking in the right way when the rain stopped and the puddles told their story. Walter Briggs had never met most of these men. He had been a private person who farmed his land and went to the cooperative meetings and came home and went out after the rains. He had not shared his method with anyone. He had shared it with a piece of drafting paper that spent 40 years in a Bible drawer. And the piece of drafting paper had, through the story of a 6-foot hole and $340 in a vegetable garden that stayed green through dry summers, taught a corner of Russell County to pay attention to where the water went. Edna Briggs died in the spring of 1980. She had been living alone in the farmhouse since Walter died, with Colt coming over most days, and Nadine driving up from Wichita for a week every few months, and the house maintaining a livable version of itself around a woman who was managing the particular task of becoming old without becoming useless. She had kept her garden, she had kept her kitchen, she had kept her opinions, which she expressed with the directness that Walter had spent 41 years getting used to, and which Colt had inherited enough of his mother's temperament to receive without flinching. She had not said much about the spring in the years after Colt found it. She had acknowledged it in the way she acknowledged most things that confirmed what she had suspected, which was with a nod and no particular expression of surprise. She had always believed the map would be right. She had not known what the map said, but she had known Walter well enough to believe that 40 years of careful observation would not lead a careful man to a wrong conclusion. What she told Colton the months before she died was something she had been carrying since the day she found the map, a piece of information about Walter that she had not shared before because she had not been certain it was hers to share. She told him that Walter had come close to explaining it, not the map itself. Walter never spoke about the map. But in the last year of his life in 1968, he had said something to her one evening that she had thought about ever since. They had been sitting on the porch after dinner the way they sat most summer evenings, watching the light leave the Kansas sky in the slow, complete way that it leaves the flat landscape. And Walter had looked northwest toward the corner of the farm where the wheat grew tall and said something she had not understood at the time. He said, "A man who pays attention long enough earns the right to be trusted." She had not asked him what he meant. It was the kind of statement Walter made, occasionally complete sentences that contained their own context and did not invite follow-up questions. And she had learned after years of marriage to receive them as they were offered without pushing for elaboration. She had thought about it since. She had thought about it after opening the Bible and finding the map. She had thought about it while watching Colt dig the hole in April, and while watching the water rise, and while watching the garden grow through dry summers. A man who pays attention long enough earns the right to be trusted. Walter had not needed to tell Colt where to dig. He had not needed to explain the elevated aquifer or the limestone fracture or the hydrostatic pressure dynamics of a perched water table. He had needed to leave something that would ask Colt to trust him and to make the trust worth something by being right. Colt sat with his mother in the farmhouse kitchen for the last time in the spring of 1980 and heard this and did not say anything for a while. The kitchen was the same kitchen where he had sat in January of 1969 with the map unfolded on the table, where he had read the notes in his father's handwriting for the first time, where he had understood that he had been walking the same land as his father for 18 years without knowing how his father had been looking at it. He asked her why Walter had not dug the hole himself. She said she had thought about that for 11 years. She had arrived at an answer that she believed but could not prove, which was that the digging was not Walter's to do. Walter had done his part. He had walked the farm for 40 years and recorded what he saw and found the crack in the limestone and marked it on the map and placed the map where it would be found. The digging was Colt's part, the understanding that came from the digging, the physical knowledge that came from standing in a 6-foot hole and feeling the water rise around your boots. That was something that could not be handed over. It had to be earned in the earning of it. She died in April of that year. She was 80 years old. Colt and Nadine buried her beside Walter in the Russell County Cemetery and came back to the farm and sat in the kitchen that had been their parents' kitchen for 41 years and did not say much because there was not much to say that the house did not already know. Wren Briggs was 13 years old when her grandmother died. She had grown up with the map on the hallway wall. Colt had framed it in 1971, 2 years after finding the spring, having it matted under glass in a simple wooden frame at the hardware store in Russell, and hung it in the hallway between the kitchen and the living room, where it was the first thing you saw when you came in from outside. He had not made a ceremony of hanging it. He had put it up the way you put up something that deserves a permanent place without announcement, and it had been there every day of Wren's life since she was 4 years old. She had studied it the way children study things that are always present in their environment, not with the focused attention of a scholar, but with the gradual accumulation of familiarity that eventually becomes something close to knowledge. She knew the shape of the farm from the map before she was old enough to walk the whole perimeter. She knew where the stream ran in the southeast corner. She knew the fence lines. She knew the position of the barn and the well and the house. And she knew the X, as she had asked Colt about it when she was 5 or 6, pointing at the circled mark in the northwest corner and asking what it meant. He had told her in the simplified language you use with young children that her grandfather had looked at that corner of the farm for a very long time and had figured out that there was water underneath it and had drawn a circle around the spot where he thought the water was closest to the surface. She had asked if he was right. Colt had said yes. He had said, "Come with me," and had taken her hand and walked her out to the northwest corner of the farm on a September afternoon and shown her the spring, the collection basin lined with limestone, the water flowing clear and cold through the pipe toward the cistern. She had crouched at the edge of the basin and looked at the water the way Colt had looked at it in April of 1970, with the focused attention of someone seeing something that is not yet fully explicable. She had asked how deep the hole was. Colt had said 6 feet. She had thought about that. Then she had asked why there was water 6 feet down. He had told her as much as a 6-year-old could absorb about aquifers and limestone and clay layers and pressure differentials, which was not much, but she had listened with the particular quality of attention that he recognized as something she had not inherited from him or from Edna, but from Walter, the stillness of a person who intends to understand something fully and is willing to wait as long as it takes. As she grew older, she came back to the map and came back to the spring and came back to the questions with increasing sophistication. She read books about geology from the county library. She asked Colt about his father's observation method with the kind of specific follow-up questions that told him she was not asking for the story, but for the methodology. She wanted to know how Walter had determined that the water in the northwest corner was colder than it should have been. She wanted to know how he had identified the limestone formation from its surface expression along the fence line and projected its underground path. She wanted to know what evidence had convinced him that the water was coming from below rather than pooling from above. Colt told her what he knew, which was what the map told him, and what Edna had told him, and what he had worked out himself from the notes and from 30 years of watching the spring behave. He told her about the snow melting from the bottom up. He told her about the grass root mass. He told her about the fence post in the November pond. He told her all of it, and she listened and asked follow-up questions and went away and thought about it and came back with more questions. And this went on through her high school years and into the years after. She went to Kansas State University in the fall of 1985. She was 18 years old and she studied geology, not because anyone told her to, but because her grandfather's map had made the ground seem like a document that could be read by someone who knew the language, and she wanted to know the language formally and completely. Her undergraduate thesis used her grandfather's 40-year observational record as its primary source, examining Walter Briggs's method as an example of informal groundwater detection, comparing the careful work of a farmer with no scientific training to the formal methods of modern hydrogeology. Her professor said it was one of the more unusual undergraduate theses he had encountered in 20 years of teaching, which he meant as a compliment and which Wren received as such. She earned her graduate degree in 1993. Her thesis work involved subsurface aquifer mapping in the Smoky Hill region of central Kansas using modern geophysical methods to characterize the groundwater systems of the High Plains. And she was good at it in the way that people are good at things. They have been circling their whole lives with a fluency that goes deeper than technique. She came back to the farm in 2002. Colt was 65 years old, and his knees had been objecting to the physical demands of the operation with increasing insistence for several years. And the arrangement that they arrived at was straightforward in the way that arrangements between parents and children who understand each other tend to be. Colt would stay in the farmhouse. Wren would run the farm. The transition happened without ceremony, which was how transitions happened in the Briggs family. Her first project, the winter before her first full planting season, was a geological survey of the entire property. She had contacts from her graduate work and from several years of consulting for water resource projects in the region, and she arranged for a team with ground-penetrating radar and seismic imaging equipment to spend 3 days on the Briggs farm. The equipment was not inexpensive, and the survey was not something that most farm operations would have undertaken, but Wren had a specific purpose for it that went beyond practical water resource assessment. She wanted to know if her grandfather had been right. Not about the spring. She had known for 30 years that Walter had been right about the spring. She wanted to know how right. She wanted to know if the map that had been hanging in the farmhouse hallway since 1971 was an approximate representation of the underground structure of the property, or a precise one. She wanted to measure the gap between what Walter had recorded with a pencil and a pair of boots and what modern geophysical instrumentation could determine. The survey team worked through December on ground that was hard with frost and easy to access without crop concerns. They ran their radar transects across the property in a systematic grid, recording the subsurface reflections that map the boundaries between different geological materials, the topsoil and subsoil and clay and limestone, all producing distinct signatures at their respective depths. They ran seismic lines that characterized the deeper structure. They recorded everything digitally and processed the data over the following weeks. The lead geologist, a woman named Dr. Carol Fenwick, who had been doing subsurface work in Kansas and Nebraska for 15 years, came back in January to present the results. She spread the digital survey maps on the kitchen table where Colt had sat with Walter's map in January of 1969. She had printed the radar imagery at the same scale as the hand-drawn map which Wren had taken down from the hallway frame and brought to the table. The two documents lay side by side under the kitchen light, one produced by 40 years of walking and looking and writing in careful handwriting, one produced by satellite-calibrated instruments and signal processing software. Dr. Fenwick went through the findings methodically. The clay layer was present across the northwest quadrant at depths ranging from 3 to 4 feet, consistent with Walter's notes. The limestone formation extended beneath the northwest quadrant in a configuration that matched the orientation Walter had identified from the surface expression along the western fence, running northeast from the fence line in a pattern that the radar had now mapped precisely. The fracture zone in the limestone where Colt had opened the spring in 1970 was visible in the radar data as a linear discontinuity running northwest to southeast, exactly as Walter had written. The volume of water held in the elevated aquifer above the limestone layer was estimated at 12 million gallons. The recharge rate based on the aquifer geometry and the permeability of the overlying material was sufficient to sustain a continuous flow for decades under normal conditions. Then Dr. Fenwick placed Walter's hand-drawn map directly on top of the radar imagery printout and held them both up to the light. The features aligned, the limestone formation, the fracture zone, the boundary of the elevated aquifer, the drainage patterns Walter had noted along the stream. Feature by feature, annotation by annotation, the hand-drawn map and the digital survey were telling the same story about the same ground. The differences were measurable in feet, not hundreds of feet, not tens of feet, a few feet within the margin of error that Dr. Fenwick's equipment carried inherently. She set the maps back on the table and was quiet for a moment. Then she said that in 15 years of subsurface work, she had seen precise surveys and imprecise ones and everything in between, and that the map on the left side of the table was the most accurate, informal groundwater characterization she had encountered. She said the man who made it had no equipment. She said he had a pencil and he had walked the land for 40 years, and what he had produced was accurate within the margin of error of her instrumentation. Wren said her grandfather had tracked the water. She said he had tracked it for 40 years and had written down what it did and had arrived at conclusions that the instrumentation now confirmed. She said he had not used tools. She said tools were a way of asking questions, and her grandfather had asked the same questions without them. Dr. Fenwick looked at the map again. She looked at the dates: 1931, 1938, 1943, 1951, 1967. 38 years of dates on a piece of drafting paper that had spent most of its life folded in a Bible drawer. She said she would like to use the map in a paper with the family's permission. Wren said yes. Colt sat at the kitchen table through the presentation and said nothing. He had heard Wren explain the survey methodology over the preceding weeks and understood in broad terms what it was intended to show. He had looked at the digital imagery when Wren brought early printouts home and had recognized the features, the clay layer and the limestone formation and the fracture zone as the same features he had encountered with his hands in the spring of 1970. But there was something about seeing the two maps on the table side by side that did not resolve into thought for him, but into feeling, the particular feeling of a thing becoming complete that has been incomplete for a long time. His father had drawn the map. His father had walked the farm for 40 years and written down what he saw and drawn the X and put the map in the Bible and died. Colt had found the map and dug the hole and found the water and farmed from it for 32 years and raised his daughter with the map on the wall and told her everything he knew about how her grandfather had worked. Wren had grown up with the map and studied the ground it described and come back to the farm and commissioned the survey that laid the digital image on top of the pencil marks and found them to be the same. 3 generations, 40 years of observation to make the map, 32 years of farming from the spring it located, 15 more years of geology education that led to the survey that confirmed it. All of it arising from a piece of paper folded in a Bible that Edna had opened 3 days after a funeral to place a memorial card inside. Walter had not left anything to chance. He had placed the map where he knew Edna would find it, in the book she had kept beside the bed for 41 years, in the book she would open to do exactly the thing she had always done with her important papers. He had trusted her to find it and to give it to Colt and to trust Colt with it. He had trusted Colt to do the arithmetic, to look at the notes and the dates and the X and understand that a man who had been this precise about everything else had probably been precise about the thing he was most certain of. He had trusted Wren, who he never knew through the map on the wall and the story that surrounded it, to take the observation method and carry it forward into whatever tools and language her generation would use to ask the same questions. Dr. Fenwick left in the early afternoon. Wren stayed at the kitchen table with both maps spread in front of her, the pencil and the radar, the handwriting and the digital printout. She did not say much. She had been working toward this comparison for most of her professional life, and now that it was in front of her, it required a different kind of processing than analysis provided. Colt went outside. It was January, and the cold was the specific Kansas cold that comes with a clear sky, sharp and deep, the kind that makes the stars look closer than they are. He walked out to the northwest corner of the farm the way he had been walking to the northwest corner since 1970. He stood at the edge of the collection basin and looked at the water. It was there. Of course it was there. It had been there every day for 32 years, flowing at 3 gallons a minute through the fracture in the limestone that his father had located with a fence post on a November afternoon in 1967. The ice on the surface of the basin was thin, a skim of cold that he broke with his boot heel, and underneath the ice, the water was moving the way it always moved, slowly and constantly, doing exactly what it had always been doing, indifferent to geological surveys and digital printouts, and the 65-year-old man standing at the edge of the collection basin in the January cold. He was 65 years old. He had found this spring when he was 33, which meant he had been farming from it for as long as his father had worked the land before drawing the X. He had raised a daughter who knew this ground better than he did, and who would carry forward what Walter had started in ways that Walter, with his pencil and his drafting paper and his 40-year patience, had never been able to imagine. He thought about what Edna had told him in the year before she died. He thought about Walter standing on the porch in the summer of 1968, looking northwest toward this corner of the farm and saying that a man who pays attention long enough earns the right to be trusted. Walter had paid attention long enough. He had paid 40 years of attention to a corner of a Kansas farm that most people would have looked at and seen only wheat. He had seen something else. He had seen the way the water moved underground and the way that movement expressed itself in the behavior of puddles and snow and grass roots and the temperature differential in November mud. He had traced the limestone formation from its surface expression along the fence line and followed its buried path to the place where the pressure would find its outlet. He had stood in a pond with a fence post and felt the water rising from below with his feet. And he had been right, not approximately right, not directionally right, right within the margin of error of equipment that did not exist when he was alive. Colt walked back toward the farmhouse. The lights were on in the kitchen, where Wren was still sitting with the 2 maps, the work that was hers now to carry forward. The map was on the hallway wall where it had been since 1971, and it would stay there as long as a Briggs lived in this house, because it was not a document about water. It was a document about attention, about what accumulates when a person commits to noticing the same thing in the same place across enough time to see past the obvious into the actual, about the patience required to do that and the trust required to pass it on. The spring was still flowing. It would be flowing tomorrow. It would be flowing when Wren's children were old enough to come to the farm and ask about the map on the wall and the collection basin in the northwest corner, and why the water came from the ground there and nowhere else. And someone would tell them, same way Colt had told Wren standing at the edge of the collection basin on a September afternoon with a 6-year-old's hand in his, explaining that her grandfather had looked at that corner of the farm for a very long time and had figured out that there was water underneath it, and had drawn a circle around the spot where he thought the water was closest to the surface. And she would ask if he was right, and they would say yes. Walter Briggs had been a farmer in Russell County, Kansas for 40 years. He had not been famous, he had not been wealthy, He had not held views that anyone outside his county cared about. He had gone to bed early and risen before dawn and spent the hours in between learning what his land was willing to give to someone patient enough to ask it correctly. He had asked correctly. He had been asking correctly for 40 years, one observation at a time, one season at a time, one note in careful handwriting on a piece of paper that went from his hand to a Bible drawer, to a kitchen table, to a frame on a hallway wall, to a university geology paper, to the permanent record of a corner of Kansas that had held its water quietly for millions of years, and given it up to a man who had earned, by the weight of 40 years of attention, the right to be trusted. The map said, dig here. The water was there. It had always been there. It was simply waiting for someone who knew how to ask.